No, I know, I'm just...
I thought it was like first time at Ice Man, like kind of a
My name's Mike Rosser. I'm from Screen International, and the news editor there. And I've been writing for Screen for about 3 years. Hello. So I'm sitting like this because I came here straight from London last night, and I was doing a Q&A with Ron Howard, and as I sat down I tore my jeans. So yes, it's just Richie Cunningham saw my Fonzie. I texted my girlfriend about it, she just went, happy days. So that's a little bit about me. So I'd like to introduce our illustrious panel. And we're here today to talk about the relationship between critics and the exhibition sector. And we've got a fantastic panel to do this. And I thought what would be quite useful is for everyone just to kind of introduce themselves, and also to just give a very brief history about their experience, so we've got an idea. So Charles, yourself.
Yikes. So I am the film editor of Heat magazine, where I work 2 days a week, and I'm also freelancing for a range of publications, including Screen International, in fact. And I'm probably, among film critics that you'll ever encounter, one that's more interested in your industry than you'll typically find. And I sort of first started writing about film when I worked for The Face magazine. And I think the first film I reviewed, sort of is aging me a bit, is Toy Story and Casino, so around about that time. And but I've been at Heat magazine since its launch.
Hi, I'm Kevin. And I should say, contrary to what it says up there, Manchester Evening News, the big issue, I was film editor at the Manchester Evening News for something like 15 years, I guess. And like most other big regional papers, they actually got rid entirely of the film writing thing. And actually these days I don't think do it at all. If they do, they take it off PA, which as I'm sure we'll get onto in a minute. Anyway, so I sort of grew up, in fact, when Anna's piece in the 80s, I was thinking, oh shit, I reviewed all of those films when they first came out. Then when we got to Nick, I mean, obviously I didn't do Chaplin and stuff like that, but I've been doing it for quite a while. So, so I've seen that sort of transition from, weekly reviews of pretty much everything that came out in this area to the exciting new digital age we're now in.
Hi, my name is Simran Hans. I write about film for lots of different publications. I actually first started writing about film through the Humble Corner House. I was on their digital reporters scheme a couple of years ago, and I've probably been writing about film for only 3 years. And now I freelance for places like BFI, Sight and Sound magazine, and White Lies. I also wrote a piece for BuzzFeed recently, which I'm going to talk about later. And I sort of mainly write about women in film and also the intersection of race in film. Those are my sort of specialist interests.
I'm Sophie Watts-Kaplan. I'm staff writer for Little White Lies, and as a visual aid, this is Little White Lies. I don't know, have people heard of Little White Lies?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll put the visual aid away. I've been staff writer at Little White Lies for the last 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was freelance, but the job I was actually doing when the editor stayed in convention was I was writing about the Big Brother house for Underville. So it was like just the best email I've ever got, just asking me to talk to Little White Lies. The first film I ever reviewed actually was a film called Hard Boiled Soup, and I was really scared, and I thought film critics were really scary, and I met Charles down in the elevator, and he was really nice.
Fantastic, thanks everyone. So I've been told that anyone who's sort of shy, retiring, doesn't want to put their hand up, can ask questions via slido.com, and you can use the hashtag TWU15, which isn't up there, but it's easy. It should be easy to remember. But you all look like very sort of the kind of people who sort of rush to put hands up, I hope. And I hope that you'll come up with some questions as well that you guys will ask. But I'm going to just get the ball rolling by, I suppose, I'll go to you, Charles, first. You seem surprised. What did you expect? This was always going to happen. This was always going to happen here and now. Just to sort of really talk about how you feel like since you began writing about film, how you feel the kind of sway over an audience has changed in the past, what was it, 40 years? 20 years, sorry, Charles.
I think it's a tough one to answer. What I would say is that, do critics have any sway at all? I was asked, do critics have any role at all in swaying audiences? And for me, I think it is, when you're distributing a film, you want all your planets to be aligned. You need to have, a kind of, a genre or compelling proposition that's engaging audiences. You need to have marketable elements in terms of your source material, your filmmaker, or your cast, or whatever. And I think that the endorsement of critics can be one of those planets that are aligning, that can help connect you to and engage your audience. But the idea that sort of critics collectively, even when they get behind a film, that they alone can, deliver an audience, I don't think that's really ever been true. And in terms of how it's changing, this is sort of stating all the obvious that critics are now, I think perhaps 20 years ago, critics were the main voice that was being articulated, and now, of course, there are a profusion of other voices that are coming through. We have all the social media platforms that allow that. I do think there is, though, still an alignment between, success and, the kind of the metaphor. But whether or not that is just because the critics' taste is actually reflecting the quality of films, then the quality of a film is likely to be in alignment with its success as well, to some degree. If you look at, say, the Pixar canon, I think better films will have tended to do, better.
But when you were kind of reviewing back in the mid-90s versus now, were you having did you have a relationship with distributors or exhibitors, about what you reviewed and when you reviewed it? And
well, one of the things that's changed enormously from those, and I'm the kind of the person that has kept, I kind of have each month I have a list of each week what films came out, so I can sort of see and go back and look. There are now typically about 18 films being released a week, as opposed to maybe 5 when I first started reviewing. So I think that the job of the critic has now changed, not just in the way that you are articulating your opinion and the platforms that you're doing it on, but it's much more a job of selection than it used to be. What you're actually choosing to cover and how you make those decisions about what's relevant to your readership or listenership or whatever.
Can I contest something that you said, Charles?
Yeah, go on.
So you were talking about how critics don't necessarily have sway in making people go and see films, but I'm thinking from a couple of years ago, a film by Kenneth Lonergan called Margaret, which didn't get a UK release, and a bunch of critics, including big names like Peter Bradshaw, but also some smaller critics, actually had some sort of, I can't remember what it was called, Show Margaret or Free Margaret or whatever.
Team Margaret.
Team Margaret, that's it. To get Margaret shown, and the Odeon and Hampton Street in London did show it due to that critics campaign. So I think there are a couple of exceptions to the rule.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to for you to bring that up. I think what actually happened with Margaret, to just on a slight sort of point of accuracy, I think Fox were always going to distribute it on one screen and not have any. They didn't have any. Didn't show it to the critics, and people who wanted to review it had to go to Odeon Hampton Street, and it was built up on social media. And then, as a result of that, it did expand to like 10 screens a week too, and they put on Fox put on a special screen for all the members of the Critic Circle so they could see it. And in fact, Anna Paquin, is that right? Paquin won Best Actress in the Critics Circle Film Awards that year as a result of that. So yeah, that's a brilliant example of a kind of disruption of the market that can occur, when everybody really, really gets behind something.
Sure. I can also say, I mean, it's also a brilliant example of them courting the London-based critics and not giving two shits about anyone outside London. Because Margaret didn't get shown, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere.
I saw it in Ken
Oh, I stand corrected. Place I rarely visit. Sorry. Yeah. But I think that is the exception that proves the rule. And basically, it's we can't do our job without seeing the damn things. I mean, state the opposite, and they can deny you access, and that's the top and bottom of how they can manipulate you.
Who's they?
I mean, the distributors.
Distributors.
Yeah. Exhibitors, I guess, they have a vested interest in you seeing it.
Yeah. And I find it's interesting what you're saying about how Manchester Evening News no longer runs its own reviews. It's pulling it in from, say, PA.
Yeah.
So I wonder, if you can talk about how things have changed, from your viewpoint, to how critics, worked previously as opposed to now. How that's changed,
Sure.
and why?
Well, why is a different question, I think. But yeah, I mean, there was a period when distributors would actively court regional critics because they actually realised that, certainly between us, and in some cases individually, we had as big an audience as some of the national papers. And also, it so happened that lots of people in tentacle A-list people had an aversion to doing stuff for the metropolitan-based publications, which they perceived as all being like the Sun. With the unfortunate exception of my colleague at the Newcastle Sun, who was forever getting knocked off junket lists because they thought he was representing the same group. And then, I think over the time I was working at the Evening News, that you were having to fight harder and harder to get them to screen the things. And when I go down to London, well, I have no objection. I come from London originally, you probably tell from my Jessie accent, but I have no objection to the place, but I do object to having to go there to see a film, or having to go, again, it's hardly a hardship going to a festival, but it's, the context in which you can see the film, was getting narrower and narrower. And also you had, my position is probably slightly different from my fellow panelists in that I was writing for a major regional newspaper, and you were sharing space with, whatever, Manchester United, news, all of that stuff. And so you actually had to, I flatter myself that some of us, you tried to write stuff, you tried to write copy that was engaging, because your assumption was that you did not have a interested audience. They were reading it in the context of all sorts of other stuff, and you could catch their attention, and one of the side effects of that was you could actually sneak some stuff through. Because obviously the editor is not going to let you not review, I don't know, Lord of the Rings, let's say, for the sake of argument, which in fact they didn't screen outside London, I don't think, however. But a film of that nature, if that opens the same week as however good the sort of film they would show here would be, Carol, let's say, they are not going to top line that, but however, you could try to give it as much equal weight as you could, because they were slightly indifferent in a way to what you did, so you could sneak some stuff through. But yeah, but it was sneaking, and they would. Not very long ago, just before I left, I had to argue the case for running an interview with Danny Boyle, of all things. Now, of course, Saint Danny, but before that, I was prior to Slumdog Millionaire, but they are not very film knowledgeable, and as much as I am. However, because it is such a democratic medium, they would somehow feel that they knew more about that than they would do about, well, actually I was going to say football, that's a ridiculous example, but there were some areas of the paper that they would leave alone because the assumption is you've got hired somebody to do it, and others, everyone knows everything there is to know about film, don't they, because we all go and see it. Would be an argument you'd hear a lot, and for my sins I was also a theatre editor, and you'd hear that a lot as well, because how difficult can it be? You sit there, you watch something, and you write about it, and that's it was perceived as a perk, in point of fact, as opposed to a professional job, which is what I think. Sorry, I know this is a lengthy answer to a fairly straightforward question, but I think that whole sort of transition to digital stuff and the real what's suffered there is the professionalism and professionalisation of critics, because everyone is one, So, you know, so the point is nobody much cares about some of those views.
Yeah, and I think you only have to sort of look at the panel to, you know, with your collective experience to know that there is, not everybody knows as much about film and the mechanics of it as you guys, and, you know, Charles, it's your like Wikipedia, except more accurate. It's amazing the kind of stats. And
Yeah, but actually, I mean, I Sophie hasn't said anything yet, but since you mentioned my name, I mean, I'm not convinced that being, you know, an expert on filmmaking is actually necessarily, you know, the best position to start out as a film critic, because, you know, in a way you want your experience of watching a film should be aligned with the audiences as much as possible. But anyway, I'm going to not say anymore.
Well, thank you, Jill. So yeah, my thoughts on what you were saying, Kevin, is that I think it's endemic to the fact that we're a microcosm within a microcosm. We watch loads of films, think films of the whole world. A great example, the critics are all swooning, myself included, over Carol, and I was just talking to Charles yesterday, and it's just not really done that great.
No, I mean, it's doing all right, but I mean, it's not sort of, yeah, I mean, it did 560 grand or whatever on 206 screens, I believe, including previews.
But like, based on what critics are saying, you would think it would be like getting millions of billions of all the money, and it's just not. And yeah, so films are not important. Well, we think they are, and then within that, critics are not as important to films as we think they are. So I think the challenge for us really is kind of similar to what Marion was saying earlier about theatre, is to go and meet our audiences, rather than be like, here we are with our knowledge and our towers, and no one is coming up to our towers to receive our little bits of wisdom. I think we just have to find a different way to engage with films and engage with audiences.
And is that way Twitter? Because so many critics are on Twitter and talking to the people who are both going to see the movies and reading their reviews. So I think like that is a kind of breakdown of the barriers between audience and screen and critic and exhibitor. There's lots of different people talking to each other.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, Little White Lies is a beautiful magazine. I mean, but are you?
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I recommend it. But I mean, are you guys having to look increasingly to digital to speak to your audience?
I mean, you totally nailed it, absolutely. We recently redesigned and relaunched our website to try and give it the aesthetic values of our magazine, whereas previously it was just quite basic. Our company director recently told us we need to have a digital first strategy. And also, just even in the 2.5 years isn't that long that I've been a Little White Lies, increasingly my editor is asking me to kind of write personal pieces and, you know, just like less of the old idea of like I is wrong within film writing. He believes, and I to a certain extent also believe that, you know, like the way the internet seems to work is through emotions, whether it's people, as was earlier said, I think Anna Hoops was saying, you know, people like to share their emotions via images, and it's like where we are trying to reflect that as well, and, you know, not distilling film watching into what we intellectually think, and more just reporting back on the emotions produced by watching certain films, and we're doing that a lot online as well.
I think we're all film fans, is the bottom line,
Yeah.
and you try to reflect that in whatever medium you produce that in.
And is it about sort of, you know, acknowledging the audience more as now that, you know, they have a much louder voice than ever previously? Before it was the critics that had the megaphones that could stand there and say, but now everybody has a megaphone. You know, is it increasingly about bringing in those voices, or do you still think there needs to be this divide almost between what critics think and what the audience thinks?
That's a really interesting question, and I'd be interested to hear what the rest of my panel thinks as well. That's not me deflecting it, I will give it a brief answer. I think Twitter is the place where you chat with your audience. On your website and in your magazine, you do try to present yourself as some kind of authority, and really it's not advisable to respond to all comments. It's just not pretty. So yeah, it's a mix of both. Like, you have to be part of the conversation, but at the same time, you don't want it to be a complete, like, democracy, because otherwise you're putting yourself out of a job.
I was just thinking that Spectre, I think, was a recent example of a film where a lot of the critics walked out saying, "Well, this is amazing, and it's 5 stars, and it's the best Bond yet." And as soon as the audience started seeing it and started sharing their views, then very quickly, I think people were kind of calling it out a little bit and saying, "Hang on, this isn't the best film yet." And the box office for it has been incredible, but how is it compared to like Skyfall, for which word of mouth was a really important thing?
Well, yeah, I keep looking to see those numbers diverge, because I'm definitely in the camp that doesn't think it's as good as Skyfall. Was really surprised by those 5-star reviews from very sort of highbrow, high-end critics. But it's kind of slightly complicated because Spectre released on a Monday and Skyfall did released on a Friday. But by kind of like doing a bit of mathematical kind of calculation, you can do a comparison. So after 35 days, I think Spectre's on something like 88.5 or something. Skyfall was on about 91.5. So it's only running about 3% behind. I would have expected a much bigger kind of gap, but just based on what I'm picking up anecdotally of audience response. Skyfall got to 103. I think Spectre's going to seriously start running out of steam, so we'll see.
Yeah.
Having friends with movie Charles, I don't think Spectre is as good a movie as some people say it. But it's the classic example of the movie like the upcoming what's it called, Star Wars, which is critic-proof. And I think some of our colleagues perhaps preempted the sort of bums on seats factor we were talking about by saying, well, we said it was 5 stars all along. And have slightly been called out, I think, by the fact that the audience haven't responded to it in quite the way they did. And also, it's true of reviewing anything, is you see it once, and then you have to rush out and formulate your thoughts without listening to any of the gibberish your colleagues thought.
This to me kind of smacks of, this is the culture of what film reviews and film writing looks like now. It is all about the new best thing, the best one of the franchise, the best Star Wars. Box office comparisons, and while those are useful from an industry perspective, as a writer who's also interested in kind of the culture and the art and the social politics of the films that are being shown, I think sometimes those conversations are being kind of squashed, and people aren't interested in kind of digging into film analysis as much as they are kind of being able to make broad sweeping statements about films. And I can't remember who wrote the article in The Guardian about it yesterday, but if you go back through the Guardian film section, somebody was talking about Star Wars and sort of what it means to be only understanding movies through these kind of broad metrics. And I think there are certain publications that allow their critics a little bit more space to look at films differently, and I think that's where some of the really interesting writing is happening.
Because I was going to ask you something about, how cinema goers are seemingly influenced by the star ratings, but a lot of interesting criticism isn't actually happening in the review format; it's happening in a different way. Is that something that, you could speak to?
Well, yeah, that really speaks to my own interest, and as a freelancer I don't tend to write that many reviews. I do them occasionally, but that's not really where my interest lies or my strength. And so I'm much more interested in interviews and sort of longer form journalism and kind of, I don't know if you would call it trend reporting, but being able to dig into analysis a little bit more. So, for example, when I was writing up the London Film Festival, I didn't do sort of reviews or appraisals of the films that I saw, but was trying to look for the broader themes of what the programming communicated. And so I think that kind of journalism is, to me, more interesting to write, although obviously there's a place for all different types of film writing.
Just before we go on, can I say, I despise star ratings.
Oh, me too.
And it would flatly refuse to do them at Manchester Evening News, which A, showed what a tough dude I was, but B, meant that whatever luckless sub-editor had read the review had to put those star ratings on because the editor was going to insist. So he,
But that's
so he had
worse.
well, I know, but yes, but it let me off the moral hook.
But that's letting somebody else give the star review instead of you. That you could have not really liked the film, but worded it ambiguously, and then your editor could have given it a 4, and you would have given it a 2. I think even if you don't like it, it's worse to not.
Ah, well, you may say that. Well, they did make me redundant, so I guess.
Screen International carries no star reviews. Thank you.
Although
we do
apart from in Cannes.
but that's different because
Why is that different?
how dare that is different because that's not one individual. That is that's a collection of critics from around the world who each give a score out of 3, and it's an average. And every year we've predicted the Palme d'Or from people, saying whether they think it's good or not. So, same but different.
But that grid is fantastic, and and everybody looks at that grid during the Cannes Film Festival, and it is just number crunching. It is absolutely, it is actually reducing these Palme d'Or competing films to a number out of 4.
But I do
it's fantastically engaging.
I do think
think of who's in Cannes, all the people who are from the industry. They're not necessarily going to have time to read all the trade reviews, but they're going to look at your grid.
I do, yeah, no, I mean, I do think people generally just want to be told sometimes, is this worth seeing or not? And that's, that's what a kind of star rating can be useful for. Although it's difficult to kind of say, when Bradshaw gives films 5 stars a week all the time, he's not here, is he? Christ. He's a maniac. Then you kind of think, well, this is the best film ever then, again, this week. So there is, Anyway, I feel like we're kind of veering off topic here, because I wanted to ask you, Simran, as well, about, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about this campaign that was kicked up around Beyond the Lights.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about that. So, besides writing about movies, I also produce and program a film festival called the Bechdel Test Fest. My colleague Karina, who's the director of the festival, is next door giving another talk, so you can't go and check that out. But definitely look at our website. But so earlier on this year, we saw a film. It was screened privately for critics, as press screenings always are, for a film called Beyond the Lights. It's a romantic melodrama. It's American. It's directed by a woman called Gina Prince Bythewood, and she is an African-American woman, and the film has 2 African-American leads. And this film was released by Universal in the UK, but it had sort of home release only, so the screening that I went to was like a DVD home release screening. And I attended the screening, there was no one there. I was the only critic in the room. That has never happened to me before, but I was there, so I watched it. And Karina and I had sort of been talking about this film because we'd heard of it and we knew that it wasn't coming out in cinemas. And once we both watched it, we just thought we have to screen this somehow. But when you're a programmer, you're trying to think, okay, I want to introduce my audience to something new, but how are they going to know what it is? And when you're still sort of in your infancy as a brand, and we'd only really started programming this festival in February, and so we started planning Beyond the Lights around April time, and then we screened it at the end of June. How do you get your audience to trust you, and how do you kind of reach people who maybe aren't necessarily following you but would be interested in the film? So we wanted to kind of create a conversation around it, and luckily for us that conversation was beginning to happen already. And Robbie Collin from The Telegraph wrote a piece about it, calling it the best film that you'll never get to see in the cinema. And it's screened at the Edinburgh International Festival as well, I think, quite positively. And around this time, I was kind of thinking, okay, as my dual role here as both a programmer and a writer, how can I sort of make these 2 different things that I do talk to each other? So I decided I was going to pitch a piece that was going to be a big investigative report on like why this film was not going to be released theatrically, which in a way, not to sound sort of self-aggrandizing, but was quite risky because Universal are a big studio, and if I'm a film critic, I need access to their films. And if I was going to be sort of putting myself in a vulnerable position and calling them out on something, that's also jeopardising my ability to write sort of about their films. But you know, sometimes it's worth taking the risk. And I pitched a piece to lots of different publications, including all the broadsheets and places like Sight and Sound, and also Dazed and Confused. And there wasn't really much positive response. It wasn't really a good fit for anyone. And then BuzzFeed's culture editor got back to me, and I emailed her, and you know, she's Bim Adewunmi is her name. She's a brilliant editor, and I just thought she's not going to respond, but I'll try anyway. And actually, she replied to me the day I sent her the pitch, and said, "Do you mind if I call you? I've got some interesting ideas about this." And so I worked with her on this piece for quite a long time, and a lot of people read it, and that was a really good way of building a conversation around something that we were already planning. So we were having conversations with Universal about screening this film, but also I was secretly working on this big report, and so we coincided the publication of the piece with the release of our tickets. So people were sort of talking about this film, and then a week later we were able to announce that we were going to screen it. So that was quite tricky to kind of create, but it's definitely possible.
Just to bring together several threads that have been discussed, I agree with Simran. The most exciting writing for me is stuff that is kind of going on in the fringes, that is almost activist-led writing about film and is deeply engaged with representation. And one of the most moving pieces, Simran's piece was like a kind of like hard-hitting investigative. The director of Bechdel Test Fest also wrote this piece on why the film mattered to her so much, and she was talking about growing up as a mixed-race person and not seeing herself on screen, and what it meant to see herself on screen. And increasingly, I think now it is a kind of grassroots, social media-driven bunch of people who just, they're just fed up with seeing the same old faces on screen, and they're reviewing films not just from the prism of is this objectively a good film. They're not pretending to be objective. They're deeply subjective, and they want representation. And and they're calling out films that have bad representation, and they're shouting about films that have good representation.
And so, Sophie, I'd also like to, and we would have run that piece. Please come to us next time. As well as...
I didn't actually pitch to screens.
No, we should. That would, because that's something that we'd really be interested on sort of talking about, so, and putting out there. And I'd like to get some questions from you guys in a second, so just have your hands and questions at the ready. But Sophie, I wanted to ask you about how you feel critics can decide on their sort of own movie writing paths these days. We're no longer having to sort of cluster around these, auteur-driven sort of mainly male films these days. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Oh, I'd love to. I like, some of my recent coverage I'm most proud of. When London Film Festival happened, it was announced as the year of the strong woman, which was kind of hilarious. If you crunch the numbers, it's like, there was like just 50 films by women and then like 180 films by men or something like that. But that was still apparently year of the strong woman. But I decided it was my mission to just go and see the films by the female film directors, and then and then afterwards I kind of wrote up the little films that I found. And a festival setting is ideal for that kind of self-discovery, because there's so many films on offer and you can determine your own path. It is a bit harder in the day-to-day grind of being a film writer, because you've got the films that are coming out every week, and I haven't totally figured out how to do that within those parameters. But I think it is a bit self-perpetuating. Once people discover that you are interested in a certain area, they will contact you. And in London, I'm sorry, it is. I know about it in London. I think it's going on in...
You do attend the festival.
Yeah. No, I know, but there was a thing called Onwards and Outwards run by the ICA, and it came around the whole UK, and it was just, it's not just film programming, it's film programming accompanied by discussion about film programming, and Onwards Outwards was all driven by women in the industry, and they had lots of discussions and stuff. And what tends to happen if you do declare your interests is that you discover all these events going on, and I think that's how you get your own path. You just kind of shoot up a little flare, or pin your colours to a certain mast, and then other people come to you. I guess it's the same as in any interest that you have. You find like-minded people, and they help you on your way.
Can I just ask someone a question? When you were pitching this idea to various publications, when they said, no, well, how did they say no? Did they say, we don't want to go into that area, it's going to reflect badly on us?
Some just said it wasn't quite right for them, some didn't reply. One of my editors who I work with fairly often got back to me very slowly, the same day, which was sort of 2 weeks after I'd approached them, as the BuzzFeed editor got back to me, and I really did think about where would this piece have more impact, because the other publication is a film publication, and BuzzFeed obviously is sort of multimedia, it's not film specific at all, and I just thought, more people are going to read it if I go with BuzzFeed, so that's what I did.
There's a gentleman in front here with a question. Oh, I think there's a mic coming to you.
I just wonder what the panel think about websites like Rotten Tomatoes and Letterboxd, which are the kind of two extremes of debating film critics, and then you've got amateur film critics, if you like. Whether they're any use to public and film programmers, and whether there's a kind of more UK European based idea of that, or could be, because I think they're quite American, sort of skewed, certainly Rotten Tomatoes. And
yeah, it's interesting. I see Rotten Tomatoes being quoted more and more as a sort of measure of how good or bad a film is. Simran, what do you think about that?
First of all, I just want to say I love Letterboxd. I think it's such a cool idea. For those who don't know, it's a sort of tagging system where you can log all the films that you've watched, or you can log the films that you want to watch, and you can keep a diary and make lists, do little notes or reviews, rate films, follow people. A lot of critics use it. I just like it to kind of keep a temperature of what my friends are watching. And also when I'm doing research and kind of looking for, some great films in specific genres, lots of interesting, really engaged people who, may not have authority are making these really interesting lists. So I think it's useful. I don't think it's replaced critics. I think the differences between Rotten Tomatoes and Letterboxd, although I wouldn't necessarily consider them the binary, but I think the main difference is who's reading them, and truthfully, who is reading people on Letterboxd? Not many people, whereas a lot more people who are interested in the film will go to Rotten Tomatoes and kind of, look at what people are doing. But I do think that the idea of an aggregator is sort of useful, because I know when I'm going to see a film, I guess less so since I've been writing about it myself, but I do like to get an idea of, what the feeling, the critical feeling of a film is, like whether it's generally positive or generally negative, whereas I don't like to read any reviews until I've seen the film, so they can kind of be useful enough, I think.
So a sort of star system, but aggregated.
Also, I like Rotten Tomatoes because it is also a repository for reviews. Like, most people use it to check out the rating, but once if I see a film and I kind of am obsessed with it and can't figure it out, I just go to Rotten Tomatoes and I try and find a critic whose view looks like it will be revealing to me.
is there anything UK European based similar, or?
Well, I think Rotten Tomatoes does include UK critics, but the way the aggregator works is that it only recognises certain publications. So I guess while it is more global than you think, it's obviously more weighted towards Americans. You want to say something? Oh, sorry. I thought you.
We'll have a chat later. It's fine.
Oh, sorry.
Is there a Slido question?
No.
Oh, great. Well, let's.
So we've got a couple of questions on Slido, and I think they might be able to be taken together. One's, should critics be advocates for audiences or stick to analysing the films they love? And the other one is, when you write a critique for a film, how do you look at it? Are you analysing it through the film, through your personal feelings, or looking at audience reaction?
Charles?
In terms of, I mean, I think your response to your film has to be your response. I think that I think that the way you have to consider your audience. So, for example, when I'm writing for Heat magazine, it's a highly curated brand. So everything that you write within the pages of Heat magazine has to represent the magazine, and you're writing with a tone of voice, and you have a very clear view of who the reader is. And because those reviews do not appear online, because our business model is actually to sell the print edition of the magazine, because that's actually where the profit is still to be found in many cases. So your readership is very, very defined by the people who are actually buying the magazine, and you have to write for them. But your opinion cannot change. And what you can't do is sort of think, oh, this is the kind of thing that my readers might like, and therefore I'm going to recommend it to them. And that is an absolute path to disaster. So you have to absolutely be true to yourself. But I think that in terms of what you can write, there are literally thousands of words that can be said about a film, but you have to choose the 250 that are perhaps reflecting the interests of the reader. So, if you're reviewing Magic Mike XXL, there might be topics of interest that would be different in Heat magazine than would be if you're reviewing for Sight and Sound.
I think those are interesting across the board, those things of Magic Mike.
I think you absolutely have to take the audience into, that's paramount. And you have a specific audience, you have a specific demographic in mind, obviously. But I think, the least interesting thing about any review is the critic's opinion. You can get an opinion by standing next to somebody in the pub, and it means that's all it is,
I have to really disagree with that.
But that's what you like.
I think people don't read reviews to find out what a film is about. They read to find out what the writer thinks of the film. People like Robbie Collin or Peter Bradshaw or Tim Roby, people who are reading those broadsheet critics, and those are the ones that are really having the most influence on the general cinema-going public, not just sort of cinephiles who read these stuff and are interested. People don't want to know, is Carol good? They want to know, what does Peter Bradshaw think about Carol? Because critics kind of have taste and authority, and that's why people read them. And I think
that's debatable.
Well, I think you do have a debate with the audience you perceive you have, and a persona, if you like.
Yeah. I'm not saying that taste is always good or that is always aligned with your own taste, but it's a specific viewpoint. I think I don't think any review can ever be objective.
No reviews are objective, and I think a lot of people also know how to read between the lines. I really enjoy reading Peter Bradshaw and almost all the time disagree with him, and I can almost take that as like a code. If your opinion something is emotionally lurid or something, I'll be like, great, that is for me. And nobody agrees with somebody they're reading all the time. There's no one in your life that you agree with all the time, but you might enjoy the style, the way they express themselves, things they highlight. And so I think it's like a mixture of both. Like, most people have an idea of if they want to see a film, and I don't think they're necessarily going to be swayed. With Spectre, I think people were always going to go and see that film, and nobody was hanging on the critics, and Star Wars isn't even going to be press screened because Star Wars just doesn't need the critics. But yeah, you can just have your people whose tone of voice you like to engage with.
I think it's a difference, though, isn't there, between an opening weekend and an opening week, and the ongoing life of the film. Everyone's going to go and see James Bond the opening weekend that wants to go and see it. But then for it to continue to take money and to exceed its previous, I think there has to be a kind of, if the critics are all absolutely hammering it, and increasingly if it's being publicly slammed on social media as well, then I think that affects the sort of longer life of the film and the box office. Do you think?
Charles?
Well, I was going to just sort of address something slightly different, which is, I think the first part of the question, was it about whether or not you can champion films for...
Be advocates for audiences.
Yes, be advocates for audiences. I don't know how you would be an advocate for an audience, but what I would say is that I think that as a critic, certainly I try and create trust with my readers, where they trust my my opinion, they trust my taste, and when I'm assessing films, I think very, very hard about that trust that I hope exists. And I think if you do manage to create that trust, then that's great, because you can then use that to recommend films. And you're not doing it for the filmmaker, you're not doing it for the distributor, you're not doing it for the exhibitor. You're doing it on behalf of the reader to recommend them something that they may not have considered. So it's not you're not doing it with a kind of an industrial ambition. You're doing it to, I can say to the readers, I think you should, I believe Heat readers will love Room, directed by Lenny Abrahamson. I don't think that they would love Uncle Boomy, who can record his parts live, and it's not my job to try and persuade them that they should, partly because I didn't like the film. But I think if you create that trust, then you do, to the extent that you succeeded in doing that, to the extent that that there's any point to what we're doing at all, I think you're expressing your love for a film that you are convinced that if the readers go and see it, they will thank you for that recommendation.
I mean, I agree with you entirely, Charles. It's a matter of being aware of your audience. And I think it's a difference between expressing your judgment and expressing an opinion without being overly semantic about it.
Also, I love that question. That's a great question, and I'm just going to pimp a panel that I'm on at 4, which is basically engaging with exactly that. It's about persona swapping and just empathy-led film criticism, which I think would go more with advocacy, empathy and advocacy in a similar context.
Next question is a lady here actually, and then I'll go to that shot.
Just wait.
You've talked about the difficulty in being able to see some films that are on more limited release, and I wonder what the importance of audience film festivals around the country is for reviewing films for a wider audience for a subsequent release.
Yeah, we get so much of our material for like almost a year ahead at film festivals. It's invaluable. Like you can really. You can watch the films, the name films that you're going to be writing about in months to come. The talent comes to town. You can bank interviews. You've just got this incredibly wide, diverse program that repays really kind of reading. And sorry, did you mean for critics or for audiences themselves?
It's when a film is being previewed, maybe has a distributor, doesn't have a distributor, and is being previewed at a festival. Does a review at a festival review build an audience for later on?
It can do. It can definitely kind of. I think there's a really kind of slow trickle down. Whereas if a film gets good reviews at a festival by lots of critics, other critics will then start taking notice of it, and it might not have got to the public visibility yet, but it means that the critics are kind of primed to start shouting about it quite soon, and then at some point it will get to the audiences. I'm interested. Because Carol, ever since Carol played at Cannes, everyone has just been like swooning about Carol. How recently did people start hearing about Carol? May. Can. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, but festivals are part of a distributor's marketing plan as well. I mean, they don't just randomly place them in festivals 2 or 3 weeks before they come out.
I am thinking more about audience festivals rather than industry festivals, because I suppose we're an industry audience, and not most audiences probably won't be reading. Sorry. Most audiences won't be reading Screen International, but they might be reading Guardian reviews of films on at Edinburgh, or Heat reviews of a film that's at London Film Festival. Is that relationship really between a preview screening or a festival screening and the audience?
Well, what I find on just looking at the traffic on screen is that as films come out at various festivals, you see spikes in traffic, and obviously a big difference between now and then is that reviews are printed and then they were chip paper, whereas nowadays the audience will see a film that they think, oh, that sounds quite interesting, Google it, and then it will kick up reviews. So it's not just a case of having to publish it around that time. They are readily available, so now that films are coming out, that, we're first seen in Cannes, people are Googling Carol, for example, and they're coming out with those original reviews. So I think there's, but I'd just like to move to the gentleman up here.
Thanks very much. I can sympathise with you, Michael, having had a split trouser incident on the way to a meeting with the Bishop of Lincoln. The first film I reviewed, which put me in my box, was Get Carter, the original one. So my contention is that as somebody in a minor way involved as an exhibitor, and also somebody involved with selection of films, I don't know whether any of you heard a wonderful programme that Matthew Sweet did on Radio 4 about a character whose name I can't remember. I think it might have been Harold McCarthy, who every week used to issue a one-page digest of the content of every film that was issued in the UK, and he sent it out to all on his subscription list of cinemas. And it would have been places like the cinema where I now have an involvement, which has been there since about 1913. And it said this will be suitable for your audience because it's this, that, and the other film. We're more interested at the exhibitor level in the content of the film, what it's about, which you don't tend to get if you read the critics. You get an opinion. I mean, critical opinions vary. In another film, I once sat next to a Radio 3 critic at an Opera North production in Salford, and it had been heavily panned by all the London critics. And as we went out for the break, I said, well, what do you think of it? The other critics didn't like it. And he said, all I can assume is that they saw a completely different production. So we're not interested so much in the exhibitor's side about critical opinion, but we're more interested in content. To try and make some sense of the selections from 720 odd films that are now being issued every year.
Yeah.
I think that's tricky because if you think of something like Carol, if you just take that based on the content, it's a lesbian love story set in the 50s. But if you watch the film, it's so much more than that. And it's... Pardon?
I think it. Voice is off.
Oh, sorry. So it was me, my own voice feedbacking. Yeah, but I think the danger with distilling films down and like programming them just based on their content means that you miss the way the story is told, which to me is the interesting thing about film. Not just what it's about, but who's telling the story, who's the story speaking to, how is it being realised, what does it look like, what does it sound like, are the performances any good? All the interesting things about movies are almost content is secondary to all of those things, I think.
Yeah, what any of those things in the Star Review do?
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, in response to that, I said we operating cinemas tend to get, particularly when you've been in the business for as long as we have, tend to get a sense of what your audience wants. And
then how do you grow that audience?
Well, yes.
How do you challenge them or lead them
Well,
new
that's
places?
what we would like to do, but we don't want to frighten them away. The other thing to say is that if we had the simple fact, I mean, perhaps consolidated somewhere, it gives us a starting point. And I said, well, that looks a bit like the first film. And then we could look at IMDb, then we can look at the criticisms, and then we can look at the reports and see what's that film really about, and get deeper into it. But look at it from our point of view, as I say, 720 odd films issued a year, we can show 50, because we do one a week. So we've got a big editing job to do.
I think we've got time just for one more quick question, and I'll take from that guy right there.
I just wanted to come back to Twitter and the relationship between exhibitors and critics. It strikes me that a good way that... Sorry, I'm from GFT in Glasgow, so we show quite a wide range of films and lots of one-off screenings of films that perhaps you guys have seen, but not really anyone else is that aware of. And I would love to figure out a way that we could develop a Twitter conversation that, with critics, whereby critics can be more active in saying, this movie that's great is on at GFT, you should go and see it. You know, like, how do you guys feel about the development of that kind of relationship?
I mean, first of all, get in touch with Michael at Film 4 because I know he's very interested in highlighting screenings across the UK, so definitely do that. He's Nevsky P on Twitter. and he's actually doing exactly that, but from the other end. That's my contribution.
I think the simple answer to that is to just get in touch with critics. Lots of PRs, festivals, people who want to promote their product will get in touch with you as a critic. They'll either tweet you or they'll email you and ask you to share, their content, say support their festival, or whatever. And I think a lot of critics are open to that, so long as it doesn't feel like you're turning your Twitter feed into a marketing barrage. But I think just approach people, and I'm sure they'll support you.
I would entirely agree with that, and we've got our Twitter handles up there already. But yeah, I think critics, are gregarious by nature. They want to share the good news, and the more often they get it, the happier they'll be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I spontaneously do use my Twitter feed to, for example, the weekend, last Friday, I was saying, it's a prestige movie smackdown between Carol with the Spies and Black Mass. But by the way, a very interesting, this is not in 140 characters, by the way, UK indie called Radiator, also available, which then, I think, Mark Commode retweeted and stuff, so it kind of got a little bit of traction. And that was a film I happened to feel sort of passionately in support of. You just reminded me that someone from Picture House asked me to tweet a thing for some one-off event that they're doing, which I haven't done yet. But, I agree that we have to do it selectively, otherwise no one will read our tweets. If it's just
No one will read our tweets.
Which then becomes self-defeating, because not only do we not have a Twitter following, which is arguably not great for us, but also we then therefore become of no use whatsoever to the people that are trying to market their one-off events.
I'd just like to quickly add as well, I would love to, if there's a film that I love, sometimes I feel like I'm not being of maximum service just by just telling people that I love it and not telling them where I can see it. So if you're pitching to people screening the films that they really are passionate about, then they're going to want to shout about them for you.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions, and please thank the panel.